In the ANMAtalks Presents sessions, we give the floor to teaching staff, students and alumni from the ANMA community. In this line of sessions, they are invited to present their ongoing projects with the aim of inspiring colleagues and peers across the institutions. In this session, we welcome Dr. Aino-Kaisa Koistinen. Welcome to the session, Writing with Others, Creative Collective Writing as Artist Pedagogy. So, Dr. Aino-Kaisa, welcome. It's really nice to see you, and thank you so much for taking part in this. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Camilla. It's very lovely to be here today, so thank you for inviting me. And please, at any point, if you can't hear me or if there's any technical issues, just let me know. And maybe, Camilla, if you could tell me like 5 minutes before my time ends, so I can then wrap things up if needed.
Yes.
But hi, everyone. I'm Aino-Kaisa Koistinen, and I'm a university researcher in the University of the Arts Helsinki Research Institute, where I started working last fall. And let me just, before I continue, I will share my slides with you. So there you go. Hopefully you can see them now.
We can.
And great. I am working currently in the profiling area called Artistic Thinking that is driven by artist pedagogy. So my talk today relates to those themes. I am a researcher, but also a poet, freelance writer, and teacher of creative writing. And my background is in literary studies, cultural and media studies, and gender studies. And I have also graduated from the Finnish Viita Akatemia, which is a 3-year creative writing program. So today I will talk about my sub-project, Writing with Others. And I will be focusing on the work that I have done on writing with a more than human companion that you can see in the picture, my companion cat, Sotku. And while I am not a professional musician or do research on music, I do also play a bit, sing and compose music. And music has always been an important art form for me. So I'm really excited to be here today talking to you, and I'm hoping that you will be able to make some connections with my work and your work that we can then discuss later. And I think that I gave you the title Writing with Others, Creative Collective Writing as Artist Pedagogy, but lately I have been playing with the title of my project a bit, and the current, a bit more specific title is Writing with Others as Artist Pedagogy, Feminist Practices of Creative Collective Writing in Times of Polycrisis. So as you see there, Sotku is resting on Sarah Ahmed's book, Living a Feminist Life. So I wanted to somehow place emphasis on my background also as a feminist scholar, also in the title of my project. And my way of approaching the concept of writing with draws on feminist studies and practices that understand both art and science as situated and embodied practices. The concept of writing with, for me, draws heavily on feminist science studies scholar Donna Haraway's work and Haraway's concepts of thinking with and becoming with, both written with a hyphen, as I also write the concept writing with. And I understand that this hyphen sort of places emphasis on the situated nature of knowledge and the sort of interconnected nature of knowledge production. That we always produce knowledge is in the process of thinking with and becoming with others. In the article Modest Witness at Second Millennium, Haraway also critiques the, quote, naked way of writing, end quote, as it produces a false, disembodied objectivity in science. Instead of the singular form of knowledge, Haraway argues for the plural form knowledges, claiming that knowledge is not disembodied but situated, embodied, cultural, historical, and societal. I recently also came across Maggie Nelson's essay, Writing with, from, and for others, where they situate their writing in the feminist context, saying that, quote, for a long time, I worried there was something wrong with me as a writer because I leaned so heavily on the thinking and writing of others. And further, that instead of wanting to hide that leaning, my impulse has often been to showcase it, to make this thinking with others, this weaving of mine and others' words, part of the texture of my writing, end quote. Feminist practices are therefore about situatedness and relationality. We always write with others. My project Writing with Others is also preoccupied with thinking, feeling, and writing with others, and how this collaborative process can be made visible in the written text. I consider this sort of collective writing or writing with not only as writing with other human beings, such as scholars or artists, but also as in the practice of writing with artistic, literary, and academic traditions, personal and shared histories, more than human animals and beings, natural and constructed landscapes, and other more than human actors. In the project, I ask what kinds of artistic thinking and situated knowledges does writing with others bring to the fore? What kinds of implications does this have for an eco-sensitive, eco-justice artist pedagogy? What does writing with have to offer to the broader collective aesthetic, poetic, and also activist practices needed amidst the interconnected environmental and social crisis, or the polycrisis that we are currently living in? To negotiate these questions, the project brings together feminist pedagogy, environmental and eco-justice pedagogy, and artist pedagogy, combining these with theoretical discussions of literary and cultural studies, queer and gender studies, feminist post-humanities, ecofeminism and animal ethics, as well as my creative practices as a poet and a writer. Now for the remaining of my talk, I will focus on my poetic research on writing with that I have conducted with my companion cat. In Companion Species Manifesto, Donna Haraway asks, and I quote, how might an ethics and politics committed to the flourishing of significant otherness be learned from taking dog-human relationships seriously? End quote. In my work, I have examined what it would mean to take the ethical implications of human-cat relations seriously in the practice of writing and knowledge production. Following Haraway's concept of dog writing, I call this practice cat writing. Here, when I say knowledge, it is also important to note that I understand it very broadly, referring also to aesthetic experiences as sort of knowledge. The talk is based on my chapter in the book Crafting Relationships with Nature Through Creative Practices, which you see in the on the slide, and it is also an open access publication. During the presentation, I will also read some poems in Finnish from my poetry collection Uhanalaiset ja silmällä pidettävät, also in the image there on the right, that was published in 2021. And I will also read at least one poem in English. Sorry, my voice is a bit hoarse today. So, in August 2018, my partner and I were suddenly offered a chance to adopt an elderly cat named Sotku. There were, however, a few issues that spoke against a successful coexistence with a feline animal. First, I had never lived with a cat and knew almost nothing about them. In fact, I had always been a dog person. Second, I was in fact quite allergic to cats. And despite these obstacles, Sotku, a glorious then 11-year-old long-haired female, came to live with us in late summer 2018. According to Google Translate, the name Sotku translates into mess, tangle, clutter, muddle, entanglement, hash, hugger-mugger, complexity, mix-up, mess-up, cock-up. These translations delightfully bring us back to Donna Haraway, whose work is preoccupied with the messy entanglements between humans and their companion species. As an avid reader of Haraway, how could I not start pondering about the messy entanglements inherent in this particular mess, this Sotku that I had been handed to? And people always think that I gave my cat this name Sotku because of my research interest, but I didn't. She had already been named in this way that resonated with my interest in Haraway's work. Later in 2019, I was rereading Haraway's Companion Species Manifesto, where the messy entanglements between humans and companion species manifest in what Haraway dubs, and I quote, dog writing, a branch of feminist theory, or the other way around, end quote. It dawned on me then that if there is something called dog writing, there simply must be something called cat writing. Following Haraway, I define cat writing as a branch of feminism that aims to take human-cat relationships seriously as part of both academic and creative writing. The questions that I have been trying to tackle in this specific process of writing with emerged as how to write with the cat about writing with the cat, how to represent our relationship and the knowledge crafted in it, and how to avoid the violence inherent in the process of representation. For Janet Grace Sawyers, dog writing is a practice where Haraway, quote, and her dogs co-create and co-construct each other's experience right down to the cellular level, end quote. Cat writing, for me, surely is also a material process. By 2019, I had indeed desensitized myself to my feline companion, so there was no denying that Sotku had materially affected me. Moreover, as you see in the image also, cats are notorious of their fondness of disturbing one's writing, and Sotku, the mix-up, the hugger-mugger, makes no exception. There have been previous experiments with cat writing, both in the academia and in fiction, even though they have not been explicitly named as such. Perhaps the most well-known academic text is Jacques Derrida's The Animal, Therefore I Am, More to Follow. Inspired by the gaze of their house cat, Derrida traces the violence inherent in the human-animal divide in Western philosophy and in linguistic practice. Derrida argues that the naming of a vast number of species under the category of animal as opposite to human, or the use of non-human animals as symbols, does violence to non-human species. For Derrida, language is a form of violence. It inherits a sort of carnophallococentrism, meaning that by naming we metaphorically devour the other. How then to write with a cat about writing with a cat? How to avoid violence? Following Irigaray, Cixous, Heidegger, and Nietzsche, Sawyer suggests that, quote, the call of the animal to the human requires an imaginative, poetic, and open response, since the necessary break with habits of thought is so profound, end quote. This is echoed by Jessica Holmes's notion that poetry can lend a voice to the voiceless, as it can, quote, embody loss, fragmentation, and absence, end quote. In fact, Derrida also suggests that the question whether an animal can think is a question for poetry. In my attempt to capture my relationship with Sotku, I too turn to poetry. To me, poetic language is a venture to go beyond the violence of naming, of taming, attempting to move from fixed meanings to the processes of becoming. As Haraway notes, quote, to be one is always to become with many, end quote. I write these following lines as Sotku lies on my ribcage between my laptop and my face. She faces me, purring, warm, sharp little claws burrowing through my sweater and into my flesh. She leaves marks on my skin that take weeks to heal. I wonder, what is she writing on me? Teen parannuksen, kesytän maailmankaikkeuden, syliini. Jos muutun kissaksi venyn, galaksien kokoiseksi. En tiedä, asettuuko kissa minuun vai minä kissaan. Eläimestä eläimeen läikkyy pehmeä lämpö, solar plexus. Kissa vastaa, tälläkin hetkellä apinanleipäpuut kuolevat, maailman suurimmat. The purring resonates in my body, and I remember reading that it can cure broken bones. And by the way, I am reading these poems here in Finnish because for me, the Finnish language versions, they somehow will relay the authentic aesthetic quality or experience that I have meant. But in the open access publication that I told you about, you will find translations, and you will also find all the references that I am here mentioning from there. But even in poetry, I feel the cat escaping my human language. I can therefore only surrender to the realization that the process of cat writing will always remain a process of chasing words incomplete to describe my relationship with Sotku. Perhaps cat writing is, in a sense, like a cat, as Damien P. O'Doherty puts it, quote, occupies a liminal space in the house and largely refuses domestication, end quote. Following Haraway and other dog writers, Sawyers dubs dog writing as, quote, political and material as it aims to create new ways of co-constructing reality with other animal species, end quote. For the last part of this presentation, let us then return to the question, what kinds of knowledges are produced when writing with a cat about writing with a cat? When Sotku had been living with us for a while, I told my partner that I never again wished to live without a cat. However, when Sotku had been living with us for a slightly longer time, I said to my partner, I am not sure that I can ever live with another cat. Should I then be talking about Sotku writing instead of cat writing? Perhaps. Haraway indeed critiques Derrida of forgetting the individual cat and never becoming, quote, curious about what the cat might actually be doing, feeling, thinking, or perhaps making available to him in looking back at him, end quote. When Sotku's attentive eyes face mine, I wonder whether she is content, unhappy, or even suffering, and if she were suffering, would I ever be able to know? Caring for a companion animal, and thus also the process of cat writing, is indeed an affective or emotional process. For Derrida, the inspiration for cat writing comes from the shame he feels when a house cat looks at him when he is naked. I too feel a stabbing feeling of shame, but perhaps a slightly different kind of shame. I am ashamed that Sotku's life as a companion animal might not fulfill all her feline needs. Unlike her ancestors, Sotku is essentially my captive. My shame is also connected to another gaze, the absent gaze of what Sawyers dubs meat animals. I face these animals as I handle the packages of meat that I buy for Sotku. It is indeed impossible to live with companion animals, such as cats, without participating in the killing of other animals. I am thus ashamed about the fact that for loving Sotku, a carnivore, I need to take part in the massacre of the so-called meat animals. Our cat writing is therefore haunted with the cultural practices that maintain that some animals are to be considered as meat, whereas others are beloved pets. I examine this in these fragments of a poem. Kuin vaeltaisimme vastavalossa, emme usko varoituksia uudesta. Tuotantoeläimet laukkaavat unissani, luulen sen riittävän. Lähikaupan hyllyt täynnä, valikoitua poissaoloa, kissanruokapaketteja. Tervapääsky lehahtaa, väistämättä, myöhää. For Laurie Gruen, the messy entanglements of living and dying between humans and their companion species necessitate that, quote, it is important to come to terms with the death and dying, the grief and mourning that come from being vulnerable, embodied, fragile animals. Faced with the dilemma of living with and caring for one animal while letting others die, I indeed began to mourn for the treatment of the so-called meat animals. This eventually led me to adopt a more or less vegan diet, as well as making attempts of writing about animals, not only as symbols or metaphors in poetry. Even though Sotku and I can never disentangle from the lives and deaths of meat animals, in living and writing with a cat, I have attempted to seek ways to be more responsible in these entanglements. In this sense, cat writing resonates with a vegan poetics that, according to Holmes, maintains, quote, an allegiance to literal animal and human presence, to the singular beings and bodies upon which the human gaze falls, end quote. Vegan poetics thus strive to make animals visible as animals, not just absences, in poetic language. I suggest that this sort of vegan poetics may also work as a tool in eco-justice pedagogy, urging us to think about our material more than human entanglements and the ethical questions inherent in them. I will end my talk with these fragments of poetry, where I have attempted to capture something of the practice of caring for a companion cat, as well as being cared for by the cat. Millaista on toisen tunto? Kämmen selkääni on painautunut käpälä, kynnen mahdollisuus. Keskiyöllä kissa kiipeää syliin ja meistä tulee maa-aineksen välinpitämättömyys, sanan tuntu. Kehräys auttaa kuukautiskipuihin. Älä silitä vastakarvaan. You talk with narrow eyelids. No taming, just living. And there is nothing, really nothing, more to be said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aino-Kaisa. So the next part that follows here, I will put myself back on screen so you can see me again, is that we will have a small Q&A, you and I, about your talk and about your work in general, and also try to bridge the gap a little bit between music and what you're doing. So that's the aim of this next part. So in the beginning, I would like to ask you, here we're talking about creative writing. For those of us who might not be so familiar with that concept, what is the difference between creative writing and just writing?
Well, that is a very good question. And I think that there might be, or it might be difficult to draw a clear line between creative writing and other forms of writing, because you could argue that all forms of writing are creative in some sense, that they all include some inkling of self-expression, for example. But I would define creative writing as something that specifically aims at creative self-expression, aims at, for example, linguistic experimentation, or aims at creating a work of art by writing. And in that sense, creative writing is less bound to communicating and representing something, and more about, how should I put it? More about the aesthetic and expressive qualities of writing.
That makes sense. And that makes me a bit curious to try to draw a comparison to music. in the music academies, the way that, and of course this, what I'm saying now can definitely be challenged, but just to start somewhere, we have a kind of a craft approach to music. You need to learn the craft and then you work with the aesthetics, again put very much in black and white. But I'm just curious to know here, it's from all of your work, it sounds like it is the craft idea is kind of that's not the focus here. It's something completely different. Am I right? Or do you see my point here?
Well, that's an interesting point, but actually, I have been thinking about writing as a craft more and more recently, and I think that it is really important that I think that creative writing is very much a craft, and I have recently been also experimenting with what I call events of writing, where the event of writing is more important than the actual text that will be created. And I also call these events of writing practices of creative writing, because they are practices of crafting and experimenting with the tool of language, even though there is no aim to create a work of art in necessarily. Of course, when you do these experimentations, often then that leads to also editing and refining the text in a manner that it then becomes a work of art, or maybe a work of artistic research.
Yeah, and just to be sure that I clarify myself, my point definitely wasn't that there was no craft in creative writing,
Okay.
but just but just it's interesting where you put the focus, because what I'm seeing here is that it's a very process based, as you say. It's not necessarily that you want a piece of art in the end. It's the process itself that's the interesting part. And of course, we have that in music as well. It's just often an interesting balance, because in the music academies, we're very much taught that you need to end up with a product, and therefore you look at so this, the whole idea of co-creation, connectivity to the world, to others, is something that is sometimes a bit challenging to work with. And again, of course, this can vary and it's not black and white at all, but it's an interesting approach that it's very, very process based, and you might end up with a work of art. But the point is the connectivity in the process, as far as I understand you.
Yes, and I think that as I do artistic research, then the process is already like artistic research. And if you, of course, there are different kinds of aims, that if you want to make a work of art, then you can use this sort of process as like a starting point, and then start to develop something more concrete as the result. But I also find what you brought up very interesting, because I also teach creative writing. And when you teach creative writing, it usually or often means teaching people who are very, very focused on creating works of art. They, for example, might have a draft of a poetry collection or a novel on the way. So I have also tried to think about it a lot, like how to implement these sort of writing practices in my teaching that urge people to somehow acknowledge these entanglements with the modern human, but how to do it in a way that the students feel that they still get a valid input, that they still get some knowledge of how to actually create artistic works through writing. So that is something that I am currently experimenting with, and trying to find a balance there.
Very interesting. And can I ask you, how do people react to the concept of cat writing?
Well, I think that I've mostly been getting really enthusiastic and good feedback. Maybe when I was like when I started experimenting with this cat writing, maybe some people found it a bit funny or a bit strange that I would create this sort of a method. But of course, now that I work at the University of the Arts, these sort of experimental methods are, of course, quite commonplace. So there is, for example, Annette Arlander, who is doing work with trees, writing, or I think is pondering with pines, her project.
And what do you feel can be gained from working this way? As I said, I think the word connectivity is something that came to me listening to your talk, for instance. How do we connect to something that we